Imagine stepping into a military hospital in the early 20th century. Bacterial pneumonia routinely killed 1 in 5 infected soldiers. Meanwhile, anaerobic microbes, the kind that cause gas gangrene, made minor battlefield lacerations a virtual death sentence. To fight these deep tissue infections, physicians relied on topical antiseptics like iodine or early sulfadrugs. But iodine only worked on superficial scrapes. Sulfadrugs often failed against massive tissue trauma, and prolonged use was highly toxic to the patient's own body. In 1928, Scottish bacteriologist Alexander Fleming noticed a stray mold spore, Penicillium notatum, breaking down bacteria in a petri dish. But it remained a laboratory curiosity until 1939, when a team at Oxford University actually tried to isolate the active compound from the mold juice. They tested their crude extract on a human patient in early 1941, an Oxford policeman dying from a severe facial infection and septicemia. Within 24 hours of receiving the drug, he made a miraculous recovery. But the team's supply was incredibly meager. When it ran out, the patient relapsed and died weeks later. The problem was the biology itself. The original strain of mold only grew on the undisturbed surface of liquid cultures. That meant relying on thousands of shallow glass flasks just to produce minute, highly fragile quantities of the active molecule, known as a beta-lactolyme. Without massive industrial scaling, this life-saving compound was destined to remain an academic novelty. Realizing they lacked the resources and raw materials to build a functioning pipeline, the British researchers packed up their proprietary mold strains and looked across the Atlantic for help. By July 1941, the Blitz was decimating British infrastructure. Facing the very real threat that invading Nazis could seize their cultivation methodologies, the Oxford team took their research on a clandestine diplomatic mission to the geographically isolated United States. The American response was organized through the newly formed War Production Board. Recognizing the extreme strategic need, the board suspended standard capitalist competition. They forced rival pharmaceutical firms to pool proprietary fermentation data that would normally be fiercely guarded as corporate secrets. To convince these private companies to scale an unproven, highly volatile biological process, the federal government absorbed the financial peril entirely. They injected over $20 million in direct funding to expand infrastructure and guaranteed the military would buy the final output. The scientific focus shifted to an agricultural laboratory in Peoria, Illinois. Here, biochemists realized that by feeding the mold corn steep liquor, a nitrogen-rich, syrupy byproduct of the local cornstarch industry, they could drastically boost penicillin yields. But the mold itself was still too stubborn for large-scale vats. That changed in the summer of 1943, when a laboratory assistant named Mary Hunt bought a rotting cantaloupe at a local Peoria market. It was covered in a completely different species of mold, Penicillium chrysogenum, which thrived when submerged in turbulent liquid. Researchers immediately took this new cantaloupe strain and bombarded it with X-rays and ultraviolet irradiation. This forced genetic mutations that created hyper-producing variants, pushing the mold's output to hundreds and eventually 1,000 times greater than Fleming's original sample. Scientists had optimized the raw biological organism and its food source. But translating that microbiological success into millions of viable doses required designing physical machinery capable of extracting the drug without destroying it. The penicillin molecule is incredibly delicate. If you apply too much shear force, or if the pH of the liquid shifts even slightly, you destroy the core beta-lactam ring. Extracting it from massive volumes of diluted fermentation broth was a chemical engineering nightmare. To solve this, the Brooklyn-based chemical firm Pfizer took a massive corporate gamble. Using $3 million of private capital, they purchased an old ice plant on Marcy Avenue and rebuilt it into the world's first large-scale antibiotic factory in a staggering 4 months. That specific building was chosen because industrial mold fermentation creates immense exothermic heat. Without the heavy-duty commercial refrigeration already present in the ice plant, the chemical reactions would have literally boiled the mold alive. Inside, engineers set up a system called deep tank fermentation. Because the fungus requires constant oxygen, they used massive impeller blades to agitate the broth while pumping in perfectly sterile air, keeping the aerobic mold alive throughout thousands of gallons of liquid. After a few days of growth, engineers utilized advanced continuous countercurrent solvent extraction. This carefully separated the sensitive penicillin molecules from the degrading enzymes in the raw broth, eventually crystallizing it into a stable, dry powder. By combining extreme mycological selection with highly precise chemical engineering, the United States successfully cracked the manufacturing bottleneck. The biological curiosity was now a standardized, mass-producible drug. Production then entered a steep exponential curve. By the time Allied forces prepared to breach the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, the War Production Board had successfully secured a dedicated stockpile of 2.3 million standardized doses, specifically for the D-Day invasion. This stockpile forced a complete rewrite of military surgical doctrine. Previously, combat surgeons left severe shrapnel wounds open to drain, fearing that closing them would trap bacteria. With circulating penicillin, they could immediately clean and suture wounds directly on the front lines. Comparing mortality rates, the impact is stark. In World War I, pneumonia killed 20% of infected soldiers, and gas gangrene was rampant. By World War II, gangrene was nearly eradicated. Pneumonia fatalities plummeted to 1%, and open fracture recovery soared past 94%. Remarkably, even while cut off from this Allied industrial dominance, Dutch microbiologists operating covertly under the brutal Nazi occupation managed to isolate their own functional mold, a secret project they dubbed Basanol. When the war ended, the heavy military classification lifted. British chemist Dorothy Hodgkin mapped the precise spatial arrangement of the molecule's atoms using X-ray crystallography, opening the door for pharmacologists to develop more stable, semi-synthetic variants. By late 1945, Allied facilities were churning out a staggering 650 billion units every month. Shortly after, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration began transferring this deep tank engineering infrastructure to war-torn nations, embedding the drug into global public health. The mass production of penicillin proves that medical miracles are rarely the product of a lone scientist staring at a petri dish. It required a tightly coordinated, state-funded fusion of government logistics and agricultural mycologists and heavy industrial engineering to turn an unstable mold juice into a tool that saved millions of lives.